Okay. So, hello everybody. You all know me, but for anyone watching, my name is Camon. And today we're going to be talking about the essentials of cameras, camera operation, camera principles, focused on what the typical filmmaker actually needs to know. So yeah, I'm recording this so it'll go online, and then I put the presentation in the Discord for anyone who wants to look on their phone if the screen's too small. So yeah.
Question?
Yeah.
What if you're an atypical filmmaker?
Well, if you're an atypical filmmaker, then I would recommend, I don't know, pick up an 8mm camera. What was I going to say? Oh yeah, if anyone has questions about anything or anything they want to know more about or clarify, feel free to just shout them out as we go. So, stuff we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about camera-related roles on a film set. So we're going to talk about who's doing what all the names and the credits mean when it comes to people who deal with the camera. We're going to talk about the exposure triangle, which is essential for all forms of photography, and it's also a lie a little bit, not much, but a little bit. We're going to talk about lenses. We're going to give a brief introduction to lenses, and then we're also going to talk about some recording formats and sort of more advanced camera settings. So roles. So arguably the most important person who deals with the camera on a film set is the director of photography. And they're also sometimes called the cinematographer, or their name might be shortened to the DP. Those all mean the same thing. Cinematographer, director of photography, same thing. And essentially, they work alongside the director to decide to make all of the decisions relating to frame composition, lighting, camera placement, movement, focus, lenses, all those sorts of things, all those camera-related features of the film are going to be decided by the director of photography in collaboration with the director. Now, of course, ultimately it's the director who's in charge, the director who has the creative vision that everybody else is just working to execute. But a lot of the times the more camera-oriented things will be delegated to the director of photography, since they specialize in, getting pretty shots. So the director of photography, they make most of the creative decisions related to the camera and the image. But aside from them, we can sometimes also have the camera operator, and they're the ones who will physically hold the camera. So they're the ones who are physically running the thing. Sometimes the director of photography will do this, but sometimes they'll want to delegate to someone who's more so just doing the grunt labor, where the director of photography is the creative vision. The specifics of what operating the camera entail will vary a lot depending on the setup, whether it's on a tripod, if it's handheld, if it's running on like a Steadicam or a big, crane or whatever. So the specifics will vary a lot, but ultimately it's the camera operator who's actually running the camera. They're usually responsible for maintaining the desired framing throughout the shot. So if they have a more dynamic shot where the camera might be moving, like say it's handheld, it's their responsibility to know what the director of photography wants out of the framing, and then they have to maintain that. And ultimately, they just have to make sure that the camera sees what it's supposed to see and doesn't see what it's not supposed to see, because on all film sets, there are things that are meant to stay out of view, lights and, grip stuff and all that kind of thing that we want to stay out of frame, and then there's the things that we want to make sure do get in frame. It's the camera operator's job. And again, like I said, sometimes the DP will be the camera operator, especially on smaller sets, but sometimes they delegate to somebody else. So in addition to the camera operator, we also have the first camera assistant. They're also sometimes called the first AC or the focus puller. And their main job, in addition to just being a general camera assistant, their main job is to keep the shot in focus. Because a lot of times on professional film sets, they're using manual focus. And they do that so they have a lot more control over where the camera is focused, how the focus might shift through the frame if we're trying to, move our attention from one place to the other in the frame. There might be focus shifts involved, and things like that. So usually they will stand on the opposite side of the camera from the operator. Typically they'll have the operator on the left side of the camera and then the first AC on the right, and they will have some means of focusing the lens. And then they're also responsible for organizing and maintaining, the lists of camera equipment on the set. So they also do more general assistant tasks. The second camera assistant is also called the second AC, or the clapper loader. So they're the ones with the clapperboard to mark the beginning of each shot. The clapperboard helps to keep footage organized and to synchronize sound if need be. They also perform more general assistant roles. They're going to be assisting the first AC with whatever they need. And they are also often the ones who are transporting the film and the memory cards to and from the DIT, who we'll talk about in a minute. But a lot of times they're the ones responsible for loading and unloading the either film or memory from the camera. So speaking of the DIT, the digital imaging technician is a job. It's sort of a newer job on film sets because it's specifically dealing with digital information. They'd be called something different on a set that was shooting on physical photochemical film. So the digital imaging technician handles the technical aspects of digital image acquisition and workflow. They're the ones who are configuring the camera's settings. They're the ones who are backing up the data and sending it offset. A lot of times, when the camera, fills up a memory card, someone will take the full memory card to the DIT, and they're going to be responsible for copying it to where it needs to be, backing it up, sending it offset to whoever needs it. And they're also usually responsible for coordinating the workflow of passing digital data between the different departments, because different departments, will have different needs, whether it's the sound people or, the editor or the visual effects people, they're all going to have different needs regardless of what data they need to be sent and when and in what format. So the DIT is coordinating all of that. So that's a lot of people who deal with the camera. And on very large productions, they will usually have one or sometimes multiple people dedicated to each of these jobs so that it can take up their full attention. But on indie productions, on smaller scale productions where we just don't have the resources, don't have the budget, we usually don't have the luxury of, having a dedicated person for every one of these tasks. So usually, some people are going to end up wearing multiple hats. Like a lot of the time, some person is going to be the director of photography and the camera operator and both ACs and the DIT all at once. And that's fine, but when one person's attention is split up between many different things, it's easy for them to become overwhelmed and to start making mistakes. So when the resources allow for it, they'll typically have a dedicated person for each job so that they are entirely focused on that one particular thing and getting it right. Now, when we are in these sets, some of this work can be offloaded to computers. We do have tools these days for autofocus and auto exposure that have gotten a lot better. It's not that long ago, autofocus was just not something that you would use on a film set, period, because it would be jumping all over the place, and the camera just wasn't good at keeping the focus smooth for continuous captures, all just for still photos, far focus once and then stop. But autofocus has gotten a lot better. And to the point where it can actually be a really useful tool for filmmaking, because it just becomes one less thing that the camera operator has to worry about. If the computer is doing the focusing 95% of the time, then they don't have to also be the focus puller. And of course, these tools are not as reliable as a dedicated, human. But when we don't have the resources for a dedicated human, they can save a lot of headaches. So questions on film roles on the set? Any? Okay. Were you gonna say something?
So director of photography, I guess, where, sorry to go all the way back. I guess, at this point, that's there's any
Yeah.
nomenclature. Because if they're kind of like running the camera, where would delineate between the roles between like a cinematographer and a director of photography?
Same thing.
Same thing?
Director of photography and cinematographer, they're the same job.
I
Yeah.
just missed that rating part.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah, same thing. Same job.
Well, you're beautiful. Thank you. My bad.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the exposure triangle. And this is something that is less filmmaking specific and more so just something that is true of cameras, period. Whether you're a photographer or a videographer or a filmmaker, whether you're shooting on film or digital, the exposure triangle is always there, and it's just a fundamental part of how cameras work. So to talk about the exposure triangle, we have to talk about what is exposure. It's more than just what you get paid in a lot of the times. And exposure is the amount of light that the camera captures to create an image. So if you imagine that too much light is passing through the lens and hitting the camera sensor or film negative, then it leads to an overly bright image, and you're going to lose detail. Whether you're on film or digital, if you're too overexposed, you're going to start losing information in the brighter parts of the scene where things are going to overwhelm the sensor and they're just going to become pure white, and you're just losing all of that information. And of course on the flip side, if you have too little light passing through the lens, then you have not only an overly dark image, but when you try to recover that image, there's going to be an excessive amount of noise and just ugly looking grain in the image. So, ideally we want to achieve a middle ground exposure that is going to maximize the image quality, because if we're over or underexposed, we're going to get a worse image. So we want it to be as close to right in the middle as we can. But exposure needs will vary all the time. It varies depending on the scene lighting, depending on the lenses that are being used, depending on the camera that's being used. There's no one static exposure setup, no one static set of settings that are going to work in all situations. Your exposure needs, if you're indoors, under controlled studio lighting, are going to be very different from if you're outdoors in natural lighting, just running and gunning and shooting whatever. Your exposure needs are going to be very different. Largely because the light levels are very different, more so than we will typically notice with just our human eyes. But our cameras will definitely notice when there's a shift in light level that severe.
A question regarding
Yeah.
your use of the term grain. I know in photochemical film it refers to the size of the actual like silver nitrate particles or whatever were used in the emulsion. What is grain in digital?
So it's in digital. The more proper term would be noise. They will often look very similar, but the causes are different. Like you said, with photochemical film, each individual grain is essentially its own pixel, right? And so when things vary, when the light level varies from one grain to the next, they'll each have slightly different sensitivities and different sizes and shapes, and so you'll have that sort of just grain pattern across the whole image that's shifting as the film advances, and so you just get sort of that random simmering all across the image. And in digital cameras, we have electronic noise that's introduced largely by the analog components of the sensor, but just like if you're dealing with an audio system and you turn the gain up really, really high and you start to hear just like that background hiss of the electronics. We get that too in digital images, but it manifests as something that looks very similar to film grain. But they are different things, but they will end up looking very similar in the final image.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, so anyway, so this is an example of a correctly exposed image, an underexposed image, or an overexposed image. So this is the exposure triangle as it's commonly depicted, and it basically represents the three main settings that you're going to be adjusting on your camera in order to achieve a level exposure. There's not just one exposure dial that you turn up and down. If there is just one exposure dial, then the camera is juggling all these things automatically on its own. But basically, the three biggest factors are going to be your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO. And we're going to talk about each of those in some more detail. So the shutter speed is basically refers to the length of time that a sensor or film negative is going to be collecting light to create an image. So, in all situations, whether it's a physical mechanical shutter that's covering and uncovering the sensor or negative, or whether it's an electronic shutter on a digital camera that's just starting and stopping the light collection, the shutter speed refers to the length of time that the sensor is just sitting there collecting light before it considers itself, okay, I'm done, I've captured an image, and then it's going to get processed. So usually the shutter speed will be notated either as a quantity of seconds. Like if somebody says their shutter is 1/48, that means that the camera is collecting light for 1/48 of a second to create each image. And sometimes you'll also see shutter speed notated as an angle, like 180 degrees, and in that case we would call it shutter angle. There are two different terminologies to refer to the same thing that have sprung up due to differences between photography and film, like movie film. Basically, when we're talking about filmmaking, we will sometimes think of the duration of a frame as being relative to the frame rate. So, for example, if we had our shutter open for the entire duration of a frame, if we're shooting at 24 frames a second, for example, and we had the shutter open for a full 24th of a second to create a frame, then we would call that a shutter angle of 360 degrees. Whereas if we had the shutter open for 1/48th of a second at 24 frames a second, then that's 180 degrees, because the shutter is only open for half the duration of a frame. And that nomenclature comes from how mechanical shutters used to work on movie cameras. They would have an actual disc in front of the negative that was spinning, and it was spinning at a speed that was synchronized with the camera's frame rate. And they would have a cutout in that disc where when the cutout portion comes around, the light passes through the disc and it reaches the negative, and then when it goes back to the other part, it's blocking the light. And so they would say, if we've cut a 180 degree hole in the rotary disc shutter, then that's going to be the negative is exposing for half the duration of a frame. Whereas if it were, say, 90 degrees, it would be exposing for a quarter of the duration of a frame. So it's just different nomenclature. You can convert between one to the other. The difference is that a shutter angle is a duration of time relative to the current frame rate, whereas a shutter speed in seconds is just an absolute duration of time. And you'll see both utilized. Shutter speed's more common in photography, shutter angle is more common in filmmaking. So in terms of the effect that shutter speed has on the image, a longer exposure means that the camera has more time to collect light from the scene, so you get a brighter exposure, you get more exposure, but you also get more motion blur, because anything that is moving across the frame while the shutter is open is going to blur. If the exposure begins and my hand is over here and it moves during the exposure and it ends over here, then in the image, you're just going to see a blur from here to here, right? And so the longer it's open, the more time there is for things to move during the exposure, and so the more motion blur you're going to see. And, consequently, shorter exposure means you'll collect less light and you'll also get less motion blur. Things will be more, crisp. And there can be an aesthetic discussion about, do you want things to be more blurry? Do you want them to be more crisp and sharp and capturing a single slice of time? But for film, when we aren't trying to make a specific aesthetic statement with our shutter speed, because the amount of motion blur in an image does very much change how that image feels to the audience. For example, a fast shutter speed can often feel very choppy, whereas a longer shutter speed would be more smeary because there's a lot more motion blur. But if we're not trying to make any particular aesthetic statement with our shutter speed, then the general rule of thumb is that we want our shutter to be at 180 degrees. And so basically, in most circumstances, you want your shutter speed to be half the duration of a frame. So if you're at 24 frames a second, your shutter would want to be close to 1/48. If you're at 30 frames a second, it would be close to 1/60, for example. And the 180-degree rule, if you follow that, it will give you a very just natural looking amount of motion blur. If you have a 180-degree shutter, it's not going to look too blurry, and it's not going to look not blurry enough. It's just going to be a very natural looking amount of motion blur. So that's sort of the rule of thumb. That's where we just default to, unless we have a specific, aesthetic idea we're trying to convey by moving away from the 180-degree shutter. Do you have a question?
No.
Okay. Yeah, so we can change the shutter speed for creative effect, but the 180 degree is a good default position. And here's sort of an example. In the top left, we have an image that was taken with a shutter speed of 1/1000th of a second, and then down here we have one taken with 1/15th of a second. And you can see there's a very different amount of motion blur between the two. So, this just sort of calls back to, what aesthetic are you trying to convey? In photography, there's a lot more leeway because, in photography, you might want there to be very little motion blur. Say you're a sports photographer and you want to capture as close as you can to just an instant in time, or you might want a long exposure if it looks pretty. Whereas in filmmaking, because we're not capturing one image, we're capturing many images sequentially, we have to consider sort of how things will appear to be moving from frame to frame. And so that's why we're more so constrained to being close to the 180-degree rule if we want a natural-looking image. So the second aspect of the exposure triangle is aperture. So this refers to the size of the lens's entrance pupil. So if you look down the front of any lens, there's going to be an opening that you'll see that is passing through to the sensor negative behind. The aperture is referring to the size of that entrance pupil. Specifically, it's the size relative to the focal length, but don't worry about that. The aperture is going to be notated as an F number. This notation can be a little bit confusing for those who aren't already familiar with it. So for example, you might see a number like f2.8. That's referring to the aperture setting. Counterintuitively, a smaller F number means a larger opening, a larger aperture. So for example, like an aperture of f2 would be a wider opening than an aperture of f2.8. And there is a bit of a method to the madness with these numbers. Every time the number goes up or down by a factor of 1.4, or like the square root of 2, I think, every time it goes up or down by the factor of 1.4, the exposure changes by one stop. So a lot of times when we're talking about exposure, we talk in terms of stops because perceptually to the eye, when the amount of light doubles or is cut in half, then that looks like an even step up in brightness. So like if I were to take a series of images, start at one exposure, double the amount of light, double the amount of light, double the amount of light, it wouldn't look like a doubling. It would look just like a linear increase in brightness. So we often think about exposure in terms of stops because it sort of counteracts for those biases of human vision. So basically, f2 is going to be one stop wider than f2.8, and then next it would go to f4, and then f5.6, and so on. So the numbers can be confusing. There's a bit of a method to the madness, but basically smaller numbers means larger entrance pupil. And larger entrance pupil means more light can be collected from the scene because the opening is wider, so there's more angles that light can come in from. And can increase the exposure, can allow you to collect more light. But also, the larger the opening is, the shallower the depth of field is going to be. And this is something that, once you start paying attention to it, you'll see a lot, is that the amount of background blur in any given image is not constant. So, at any given time, only an infinitely thin slice of the image is going to be perfectly in focus, right? But then there's going to be a space, on either side of that could be, close enough to being in focus. Like if I focus on a particular object, there's only going to be one, infinitely thin slice that's going to be exactly in focus. But then, if it's a little bit closer to the camera or a little bit farther away, it's going to still look like it's in focus. It's going to be close enough. But sort of the amount of leeway that you have before things start to look blurry, that is the depth of field, and that will change with your aperture. So if you open the aperture up wider, the background is going to be blurrier. And if you close down the aperture, the background is going to be more so in focus. And yeah, so a smaller opening will reduce the light collection and also deepen your depth of field. It will deepen the amount of distance that you can see while it's still being in focus. And different lenses will have different aperture ranges, with lower f numbers generally being more desirable. Usually, you'll see cameras say like, oh, well, this lens is an f2.8. Well, really what that means is that it can open up as wide as f2.8. That's the widest it can go. You can also close it down a lot of the time to however small you would want the aperture to be, but usually the constraining factor is how wide can you open it, how much light can you let in. And so usually lenses that can open their apertures up wider are considered better, because you can always close them down if you need to. But going back to what we were saying about depth of field, a shallow depth of field where the background is blurry may or may not be desirable depending on the shot. So if you look at these examples, in the bottom right here we have an image with a relatively deep depth of field. We have our subject in perfect focus, and then you can still make out, quite a bit of detail in the background. So the background is closer to being in focus, despite being farther away than the subject is. Whereas, on the top left here, the background is very blurry, right? And that's a difference of the aperture. If you have, a wider opening, shallower depth of field, smaller opening, deeper depth of field. But again, this also affects your exposure. So sometimes you might not be able to just set the aperture to whatever you want it to be. If you're shooting at night and you want a really deep depth of field, that could be a challenge, because if you close down that aperture, you're constricting the amount of light that's getting into your camera. And if you're already struggling for light, then you might just end up being underexposed, So that's sort of, this is the balancing act of the exposure triangle, is each of these settings is going to change an aesthetic quality of our image, but also change our exposure. So the last aspect of the exposure triangle is called the ISO, or the exposure index. And this is probably the most misunderstood aspect of the exposure triangle, and this is why I will say that the exposure triangle is sort of a useful lie. And the reason is that this ISO notation in the modern day with digital cameras is very misleading about what's actually happening. So historically, ISO would refer to the sensitivity of film stock. You could go out and you could buy film stock and it'd be rated at ISO 800, or this one would be rated at ISO 250, or this one would be ISO 1600. And the higher the ISO rating on the film, the more sensitive it was going to be to light, the less light you would need to make an image with that film. So, if you were going out and shooting on a bright sunny day, you'd bring your 250 ISO film because it needed a lot of light, and you were going to give it a lot of light. Whereas if you're shooting in the dark, you would shoot on your, say, ISO 1600 film because that didn't need as much light to make an image. So the ISO would refer to the sensitivity, and this is something that was actually measured and cataloged and advertised for each individual type of film stock. Yeah, so higher ISO meant more sensitive film that needed less light to make an image. Another effect was that higher ISO stocks tended to have more noticeable grain. So this idea built in people's mind that if I have a higher ISO stock, I don't need as much light, but the image is going to be grainier, right? And so this name carried forward into the age of digital cameras, even though it really shouldn't have, because the ISO rating isn't really applicable to a digital camera like it is to a film stock. But nonetheless, if you go into most digital cameras these days, there's a setting called the ISO setting. And this is why the exposure triangle is a lie. So we're going to talk about what ISO actually means on a digital camera. Just like a film stock, every digital camera is going to have a native sensitivity to light. So this is going to be for every individual camera sensor. Different models are going to have different sort of native inherent light sensitivities, the amount of light that they need to make an image. And that's going to vary from camera to camera. Now, unfortunately, this native sensitivity is usually not really advertised anywhere, and you just have to figure it out camera to camera. So usually the manufacturer will not tell you what the sensitivity is. You have to figure it out for yourself, which is unfortunate. Now, within a digital camera, what actually happens when we change our ISO setting is we are not changing the sensitivity of the sensor. That's fixed. What we're changing is the gain on an amplifier that's inside the camera. So when the sensor collects light, and it collects a certain amount of light and it gets an image, whether it's overexposed or underexposed or properly exposed, what have you, for the amount of light that it collected. And then for every pixel, there's an amplifier, an analog amplifier that will turn up the gain on that signal. So it'll make it brighter, basically. So there's an amplifier that can make the image uniformly brighter if you turn the gain up. But much like increasing the gain on, say, an analog speaker, when you turn the gain up, you're going to increase the volume, but you're also going to increase the noise. If you ever, had like a big speaker, you have the gain down low, you don't really hear anything, but you turn the gain way, way up, you start to hear all that hissing, all that electronic noise in the signal. And yeah, it makes the signal really loud, but it also makes the noise louder. And the same idea applies to cameras. It will make the image brighter if you turn up the gain, but it will also make the noise brighter and the noise more significant in the image. It's the same principle, just applied to something visual rather than something auditory. And the reason I say that the exposure triangle is a lie is that ISO does not change the exposure. Because at the beginning I said that exposure is the amount of light that your camera collects to make an image. But adjusting the gain after the light has already hit the sensor does not have any effect on the amount of light hitting the sensor. So ISO does not affect exposure in any way. What it can do is it can make it look like it's changing the exposure. It can take an underexposed image and make it look like it isn't underexposed. You could say, take an image of the native sensitivity, it's like, oh, that's too dark. And then you turn up the ISO and then it makes it look like it's not too dark anymore. But the image is still underexposed. You're still not getting enough light. But the ISO is masking that. So, because like I said, noise gets amplified along with the rest of the image. So if you have an underexposed image and then you crank up the gain, then yeah, you're bringing your image back to something that looks normal, but you're also boosting that noise. And so this is why higher ISO images will look noisier. They'll look like they have more, again, like film stock, they'll look like they have more significant grain. This is where the terminology comes from, even though it's not really the same thing. In film, higher ISO film meant you didn't need as much light to make an image, but there'd be more grain. In a digital camera, turning up the amplifier meant you didn't need as much light to make an image, but you had more digital noise. They look very similar, even though the mechanism is different, so they're called the same thing, even though they're not the same thing. Yeah. So any questions about that? Okay.
You explained that really well.
Okay.
Because it put it into perspective.
Yeah. It's something. This is one of the things that I normally, for this presentation, I try not to talk about the stuff that only I'm going to care about. But this is just one thing that annoys me enough that I'm going to put it in here.
I'm sorry that ISO distresses you so much. I can hear
it. It does. It distresses me so much. It does because the way that it's explained is just not true, and it yeah.
Yeah, most people I talk to have no idea what the difference.
Yeah.
Like what native.
Well, and you can't blame them because the camera says that it's the ISO, that the camera says that it is, but it's not. So that's why some cameras will call it the exposure index. You'll see like something EI. It's more accurate to what's actually happening. They're not calling it the ISO because it's not the ISO. Anyway, so to set the ISO correctly, you need to determine your camera's native ISO. And usually this is going to be the lowest one. So this is going to be the lowest ISO that'll let you set in the menu. And that's basically going to correspond to the amplifier not being turned up at all. It's the amplifier on its minimum setting. That's the native ISO. And then you're going to want to try to expose the image such that it looks good at the native ISO. So ideally, set the ISO as low as you possibly can, expose for that, and if you can get good exposure with the ISO at its minimum, then great. That's going to give you the best image quality because the noise is going to be at a minimum. It's not being amplified. And you can turn the ISO up if you need to, but it's going to come at the cost of image quality. It's going to amplify the noise. It's going to give you a grainier looking image. And so this is sort of a trade-off decision. Is it worth having a noisier image for the sake of achieving the desired aperture and shutter? Maybe. If, say, for example, you're shooting in a darker scene, but you want a really deep depth of field. You want everything to be in focus. You don't want anything to be blurry, and that's really important to you. Well, you can tighten down the aperture, and that's going to bring your exposure way, way down. You're going to get an underexposed image, and you can turn up the ISO to compensate. And your image is going to be noisier, but you're going to have that really deep depth of field that you wanted. Now, is that worth it? Well, it just depends on what's important to you. If you keep the ISO at the minimum, it's going to give you the least noisy image, the best quality image. But if there's something important that you're trying to achieve with your shutter speed or your aperture, then you can use the ISO to compensate for an improper exposure at the cost of image quality. And different cameras will have different behaviors when it comes to their ISO, so it's important to do research. Like I happen to know, for example, on my camera, it has two native ISOs. If I set it to ISO 640, that gives the best results, and then you turn it up and it gets worse and worse and worse until it hits 12,800, and then it gets better all of a sudden. But you have no way of knowing that without researching the specific camera. There's no rule that just dictates that's how it is. You just have to know how the individual camera that you're using deals with ISO. So that's the exposure triangle. Now we're going to talk about lenses for a little bit. So every camera needs a lens. If they didn't have a lens, you just have a blurry, indistinct image as light was coming in from all angles. And the lens is actually going to have just as much, if not more, of an effect on your finished product than the camera. Lenses come in many different shapes and sizes. There's a huge range out there. You can have fixed lenses that are built into the camera body. You can have interchangeable lenses that you can detach and reattach. You can have zoom lenses that can zoom, or prime lenses that can't. You can have manual lenses where everything's mechanical, or you can have computer-controlled lenses where it's all just instructions to a chip that's moving some motors. You can have quote-unquote artistic lenses that give you a really interesting aesthetic, or you could have accurate lenses that aim to be as true to reality. There's a huge different range of kinds of lenses out there. But the most important things to know are about the focal length of the lens, the aperture range of the lens, and the distortion introduced by that lens. So the focal length plays an important role in determining the field of view of the camera. The focal length is going to determine whether you have a wide shot or whether you have a close-up or whether you have a medium. A shorter focal length will give you a wider shot, whereas longer focal lengths will be more zoomed in. It'll have a tighter field of view. Now, prime lenses, we call prime lenses what they are because they have a single fixed focal length that doesn't change, whereas zoom lenses have a range of focal lengths that they can move between. So, for example, the lens that's on my camera over there is a 24-70 because its focal length can be 24 millimeters for a wide shot, it can be 70 millimeters for a tight shot, or it can be anywhere in between continuously. It can just adjust its focal length. But, I also have a lens that's a 30 millimeter, period. It's just 30 millimeters, there's no zooming. So that's the difference between prime and zoom lenses. And the reason why we would still have prime lenses is because if you don't have to zoom, it makes the optical design simpler. So prime lenses can be better quality for the same amount of cost, but you lose the flexibility of being able to zoom. But an important thing to note about focal length, while we often notate the focal length in millimeters, actually figuring out the field of view that you're going to have requires knowing both the focal length of the lens and the size of the sensor that lens is going to be covering. So we often use what we call the 35 millimeter equivalent to avoid confusion. And the reason is basically if you have a camera like the one over there that has a sensor the same size as a frame of 35 millimeter photo film, right? 36 millimeters by 24. So if you have a camera with that size sensor and you put a certain focal length lens on it, that's going to give you one field of view. So say I put a 24 millimeter lens on that 35 millimeter sensor, but then I take that same lens and I put it on a sensor with half the size, say a 16 millimeter sized sensor. Then the lens has the same focal length, but the sensor is half the size, so it's almost like the sensor is cropping in on the image, and so you get a tighter field of view. So the image would be twice as tight on the smaller sensor as it would be on the larger sensor, even though the focal length is the same. So to eliminate that confusion, we often will calculate the 35 millimeter equivalent, and that lets us actually know something about the focal length. So if you just say, I'm shooting at 24 millimeters, that on its own doesn't let you figure out the focal length. But if you say, I'm shooting at 24 millimeter equivalent, that does mean something, because it means that the field of view you have is equivalent to a 24 millimeter lens on a 35 millimeter sensor. So usually, if we have smaller sensors, we'll calculate the 35 millimeter equivalent so that people can keep it all straight in their heads, what the field of view is, because usually it's the field of view that we care about, less so the physical focal length of the lens. And here's a little just diagram depicting that. So, if you have an ultra wide angle, fisheye like that, 14 millimeter, pretty wide, 24 millimeter, still fairly wide, and then you start to get into your more medium angles like 35 millimeter, 50 millimeter, and then your sort of telephoto lengths like 85, 100, 200, 400, 600 are going to give you a really narrow field of view. So a lens is also going to have an aperture range. This is like we talked about when we were talking about the aperture. Quote-unquote fast lenses, you'll sometimes hear them called fast or slow lenses. They're going to have lower f numbers. Their aperture can open wider. They can collect more light. That's generally desirable. Again, we already talked about the impact the aperture has. Every lens is going to have a different range of apertures that it can go between. Some tiny lenses, like on fixed, like phone cameras, action cameras, drones, stuff like that, they'll have a fixed aperture that you actually can't adjust. But most lenses on, say, camcorders or, mirrorless cameras or anything professional, it's going to have an aperture range that you can adjust. And the last aspect that most people need to know about lenses is the distortion. So lenses are always going to naturally distort the image that they produce away from reality. In a perfect world, maybe a lens would be a perfect, mathematical projection of its field of view, onto a 2D plane. But in reality, when we're talking about something, physical and manufactured, they're never going to be perfect. They're going to create some distortions, and those distortions come in all different shapes and sizes. Like you have chromatic aberration, or you have barrel distortion, or what have you. And different lenses will try to compensate for these distortions to varying degrees. And this is built into the optical formula of the lens. And this is just one of the things that makes lenses different. Some will compensate for distortion in different ways. And some filmmakers will find certain kinds of distortion aesthetically pleasing. And they'll say they want lenses with character, right? And that's totally valid. Because, sometimes people don't necessarily want their films to look like real life. They want it to look like something more fantastical than real life. And so if you like the aesthetic produced by a heavily distorted image, then maybe you want to intentionally use a lens with more distortion because you like what it does to the image. And that's totally valid. Whereas other filmmakers want their lenses to be as accurate to reality, to reduce distortion as much as possible so that it's perfectly clean and sharp. And so this is why lens choice is so much of a creative decision, because different lenses are just going to give you different looks. And so there's no best lens, and that's why different films will use different sets of lenses. It's usually not about the money. It's usually about the character of the lens, what kinds of distortion it produces, and it's all just done to the filmmaker's taste. So as an example, this image is highly distorted. It's focusing on that little petal there, but we can see we've got like this swirly, out of focus areas, and shapes are being bent, and all this cool stuff is happening. And it's like, well, is that the aesthetic that you want for your movie? If it is, then maybe you want to go with that lens that's got all that distortion on there. Or if you don't like how that looks, then maybe you want to go with a clean lens. It's all just an aesthetic choice that's up to the filmmaker. So the last thing we're going to talk about, we're getting close to the end. I'm going to talk about recording formats and some of the more advanced settings that you might need to know for filmmaking. So if we move beyond the exposure triangle, there are other settings that are going to impact our image quality that don't directly deal with exposure. So of course there is the image's resolution in pixels. There is its frame rate, the number of frames that are captured every second to create the illusion of motion. There's the codec, how the image is compressed and encoded. The color space and gamma, it's talking about how we're representing color in a digital format. And we're going to talk about each of those in detail. So the resolution is, like I said, the dimensions of the image in pixels. There's other things, if you have a, say a really blurry lens, then, the resolution isn't going to be necessarily representative of the total sharpness, but it's the closest thing we have to an actual, measure of detail in an image. It's just the number of pixels that go into the image. We'll usually notate the resolution in either something P, if we're talking about the vertical resolution. So 1080p means there's 1080 pixels on the vertical, or 2160p is 2160 pixels on the vertical. We'll also sometimes, more and more, you'll see K notation, where that's referring to the approximate horizontal resolution. So say 2K means there's roughly 2000 pixels on the horizontal, and 4K means there's roughly 4000 pixels on the horizontal. Just different ways of notating resolution. And almost all cameras that are made these days can do at least 4K resolution, so that's sort of the new standard that everyone is moving towards. And usually, if we have the resources to, we'll want to choose the highest resolution that we can, practically, because there are benefits to shooting at a higher resolution, even if you're not going to be displaying at that resolution. There are reasons why filmmakers shoot on 8K cameras, even though nobody has an 8K TV in their home. The filmmakers know that. They're not expecting anyone to watch their movies in 8K, but there are still benefits to shooting in 8K that have a lot to do with flexibility in post. Having extra detail, more than you need, can be really helpful for visual effects and for cropping in and other things. But sometimes shooting at higher resolution will come with trade-offs. The data rate is almost always higher, so you usually end up with bigger files shooting at higher resolution. Sometimes the camera is going to struggle to read out that many pixels, and so the readout speed is going to go down. It might increase the amount of rolling shutter artifacts in the image if you're shooting at high resolution. It might lower the frame rates you have available. Depends on the camera. Some deal with higher resolution better than others, of course. Sometimes there are trade-offs, sometimes there aren't. Frame rate is the number of individual pictures that are shown every second to create the illusion of motion. A movie is not really moving, it's just a sequence of still images. Play them back fast enough, it looks like it's moving. Sort of the minimum frame rate to achieve the illusion of motion is around 15 frames a second, but even then it doesn't really look very good. So like I said, minimum is around 15 frames a second. We'll usually notate the frame rate either with P for progressive scan or I for interlaced scan. I just mentioned that so you know what the I, if you see the P versus I notation. Interlaced scan is obsolete. We don't want to deal with it. If you see something that says like 1080i, run. Interlaced scan, it was for TV, but it's obsolete now, so we just use P for progressive scan. 24p is a standard for film, and it has been for over 100 years. For a very, very long time, in the early days of film, basically everybody just settled on 24 frames a second as the healthy middle ground, because the higher the frame rate, the more film they were going to have to buy, because the more frames they were going to capture. But the lower the frame rate, the more stuttery the image would look. So they wanted to find the balance point of, where does the trade-off between, cost and image smoothness come. And they came to the conclusion that 24 frames a second was the best balance point, and that sort of just became the standard. It's become a subconscious association where when people see 24 frames a second, it looks like film. And other frame rates like 30p, for example, or 60p, they do exist and they have their uses. For stuff like television, you'll see 30p a lot. For like video games, you'll see 60p a lot. They have their uses. But for filmmaking specifically, we usually stick with 24p just because that's what everybody is used to and that's what everybody's expecting. You may remember there was a big debate about the Hobbit films when Peter Jackson came out with them, not just because they were terribly written, but also because they were released in 48 frames a second instead of 24. And some people were like, oh, this looks so weird, because they're used to 24. So usually we stick at 24 frames a second unless we have a reason not to. The main reason why we would want to shoot higher than 24p is for slow motion. If you want to do a slow motion shot, you can shoot at a higher frame rate, and then you play it back at 24, and then time goes slower. So if you shoot at, say, 48 frames a second, play it back at 24, you have 2x slow motion. The most important thing about frame rate is you make sure that the camera frame rate matches the project frame rate. You make sure this is true for all of the cameras. Because any frame rate can be fine, but when you really run into problems is when you have a mismatch. If you have one camera that's shooting 24 frames a second and another camera that's shooting 30 frames a second, you're going to have a problem because you're going to have to convert 30 frames to 24 frames or 24 frames to 30 frames, and you're going to get stuttering and just odd motion in the image. And so really the most important thing is just to make sure that everything is consistent. Whatever frame rate you choose, if you want to do 30p, if you want to do 60p, 24, whatever, just pick what your project frame rate is going to be, what the frame rate of the final product is going to be, the final film, and then set all your cameras to match that. And then you're going to be fine. But if you mix and match frame rates, that's when things get really tricky. Codecs. So codecs refer to the procedure that's used to turn an image into a sequence of numbers for digital storage. Because nowadays when we're dealing with digital cameras, the image isn't physical anymore. It's not on a physical frame of film. It's all just numbers in the computer. And we need some sort of algorithm or procedure to systematically turn, a 2D color image into just one long string of numbers. And the codec refers to what procedure we're using to do that. A simple codec could be one that, just reads out the value of every pixel and puts it in sequence. But the problem with that is that there's no compression. And uncompressed video is extremely large. The files are just enormous. It's just not practical. So almost always for video, we're going to be compressing our images to save on file space, because otherwise, you'd be filling up terabytes of space in minutes, or whatever, depending on the resolution. So another thing that the codec determines is it determines the type of image compression that's applied and also the amount of compression that's applied. It's sort of like the debate between, PNG versus JPEG or whatever, because like JPEGs are going to be smaller, but it's because they apply compression that reduces the detail. So the more compression you add, the smaller the files are going to be, but the image quality is going to be lower because these lossy compression methods they'll reduce the file size by getting rid of bits of information that are less important in the image. And so the more you compress the image, the worse the quality gets. But you also get smaller files. So the codecs, in addition to determine the amount of compression, the compression algorithm, they can also have different bit depths. And this is basically, again, this is something that's not really translatable to film. But more bit depth basically means you have greater color fidelity. It'll be better at recording subtle variations in color, and that offers a lot more flexibility in post, especially if you're making a film for different kinds of screens. Having more bit depth is better. So for example, if you have a codec that says it's 10-bit, that's going to be better than a codec that says it's 8-bit in general. The type of compression chosen can also have an impact on the editing process. Some codecs are easier to edit. They require less processing power, whereas some codecs will have the most efficient possible compression, like the latest and greatest codecs like AV1 that are really, really good at squeezing as much quality as possible into as few bits as possible. They're really good for efficiency and maintaining good quality at really small file size. But they're also really complicated algorithms that take a lot of computational work to decode. And so if you bring an AV1 file into your editor, your computer is going to slow to a crawl and it's going to chug trying to edit that. Whereas other codecs like ProRes or DNX are designed for editing. They're simpler algorithms that are easier to work with, so you don't need as powerful a computer to work with them in editing. And in general, we want to use the highest quality and least compressed codec that we have available. But a lot of the times that leads to really big file sizes. So, if we need to save storage space, we can choose more compression because, storage space isn't free, so if we need to save space, then we can choose a more compressed codec that will reduce our cost a bit at the cost of some quality. And this is one of the things that makes, consumer and prosumer cameras different from, say, high-end professional cameras. Usually, the really high-end cinema cameras will have less compressed codecs available. So, the big movies are shot with either no compression at all or, very minimal compression, whereas a more consumer-oriented camera, they're going to have much more heavily compressed video files. So that's just one thing that makes different kinds of cameras different. The last thing is color space and gamma. So this is referring to the method that we use for encoding color as numbers. And we're used to seeing representations like RGB, where a color is represented by one number represents the amount of red, one number represents the amount of green, and one represents the amount of blue. That's a representation that a lot of people are used to, and it works, but it depends on a bunch of shared assumptions about how color is encoded. Namely, when I say how much red there is, okay, well, what's red? There's a bunch of different colors that are red. Which red are you referring to? So using something like RGB depends on a lot of shared assumptions. So that's why we have other color spaces available. And a lot of times filmmaking is going to deal with other color spaces and gammas besides the typical sRGB. If you just go on the internet and you're looking at colors, you're seeing sRGB, that's a color space. But cameras will often have a wide range of other color spaces available. So yeah, the color space determines the range of colors that you have access to. Not all screens can reproduce the most vibrant and saturated colors. So the color space can serve to sort of limit the range that you're encoding. A color space called Rec. 709 is typical for SDR screens. That's what you're seeing right here is Rec. 709. Another color space called P3 is used for HDR or for movie theaters. And basically the difference is that P3 can encode more saturated colors than Rec. 709. So there are some really vibrant greens, for example, that you can represent in P3 color space, but not in a Rec. 709 one. So wider color spaces give us more brilliant images, but they're more expensive, and sometimes we're mixing and matching color spaces for different kinds of screens. Because for example, movie theaters are usually working with the P3 color space, whereas the internet is working with Rec. 709 or sRGB. So if you're delivering to both the internet and a movie theater, you have to think about these things. And the gamma of an image determines the relationship between linear light and the encoded value. So like I mentioned, to the human eye, if you double the amount of light in a scene, it doesn't look like the brightness has doubled. It looks brighter, but it doesn't look twice as bright. And if you cut the amount of light in half, it looks dimmer, but not twice as dim. That's because human eyesight is nonlinear, just like our hearing is nonlinear. It's logarithmic. You increase the volume of a sound by a factor of 10, and it looks like it's just doubled. It's similar with vision. Our eyesight isn't linear, but our camera sensors are linear. So we use gamma correction to account for that and sort of bias our images in a way that makes them more pleasing for human eyesight. The most important thing is that the gamma and the color space of the image that's encoded have to match that of the display, or else the colors won't look right. You might have noticed if you shoot on a camera with, say, a log format. This is something that we'll talk about in a second. But higher end cameras will often shoot in quote unquote log formats, and the image right out of the camera looks really flat. It's washed out, it's desaturated, there's no contrast. It's like, well, it's not because the camera's done something wrong, it's because it's encoded the image for a different gamma and a different color space than what your display is expecting. So it looks wrong. But if you make the gamma and the color space match, then the image is going to look right. So the camera will usually allow the user to choose a color space and gamma that they want to use for encoding the image. Some of the time it's going to give you a profile that's meant to look good on a certain kind of display without additional processing. So for example, if you go on your phone, it'll let you choose between SDR and HDR, so it'll say, if you choose SDR, it'll just encode the image so that it looks good in Rec. 709, and you don't have to do any weird correction to it. You don't have to mess with it. It just works on that kind of display. Or you choose HDR, and it's encoding the image differently. It's encoding it for a different kind of screen, for an HDR screen, but still, it's meant to just go to that screen without any processing, and it'll look fine. Whereas a lot of the times, for higher-end workflows, we're shooting in log to preserve as much information as possible for editing. Cameras will have special gammas and color spaces in them that are not really designed to be viewed directly. They're designed to encode information from the camera as efficiently as possible. So for example, if the camera that I have over there, it's shooting to a gamma called S-log3. And if I were to take that S-log3 image and just put it on this screen without doing anything to it, it would look flat and washed out. It wouldn't look right. But the reason why it's doing that is because S-log3 is encoding the full dynamic range of the sensor as efficiently as possible. It's recording the full, high dynamic range image. And then in an editing software, I can convert that gamma to a different one that will look right on a display. But by shooting in a format that captures as much of my camera's capabilities as possible, then I can get better results. So yeah, like I said, log images, they have to undergo a color transform or else they won't look right. But once they do, then you have more flexibility to mess around with the colors than you would if you just shot for a display type directly. You can make your movie in Rec. 709, for example, but for one thing, it might not take full advantage of the screen if you say send it to a movie theater, but also it might not take full advantage of your camera's capabilities because your camera might be able to see more dynamic range, but it's throwing some of it away to make it fit on the screen. So yeah, log images are also useful because they can be converted to many different display standards. And higher end workflows on bigger sets will even go a step further with RAW. And quote-unquote raw images are usually processed even less than log images, again, encoding the full capabilities of the camera, but they require special handling in order to decode and edit them. And RAW is typically only available on higher-end cameras. You won't see it on consumer cameras, for video at least. You can find RAW photography pretty easy, but RAW video is a lot harder just because the data rates are so high. That's it. I'm done. Does anyone have any questions?
What's the difference between a video, the DP, and the cinematographer?
The same thing.
I'm joking.
Yeah, I know. Okay. Well, if there's no questions, then that's it. That's my presentation.
Huzzah.
So, thank you, everybody.